go. Okay, so this is, as you can see now, a list of gemstones that are predominantly used in the gem trade, and a lot of them are underlined, and that means that they have varieties. Note that there are some that are not underlined, and that means that they're just species that don't have varieties. So for instance, iolite is simply iolite. It is there by itself, and it's just known as simply as iolite. Whereas the other ones, like beryl and our garnet and corundum and quartz, the ones that we're studying today, are underlined, and therefore they have varieties. So a variety is just recognized as an individual component of the species. So whether that has to do with color or chemical composition or a combination of the two, that's how we're distinguishing these varieties within the species. Corundum is a good example of a species name that you may not have heard of, but you've probably heard of the varieties, which are rubies and sapphires, and a few other fancy sapphire colors, but I don't know if many of you knew that they were related. So let's get started with beryl. As you can see, this is a very colorful species here, and you probably recognize a few of these gemstones on this picture. Beryl is a beryllium aluminium silicate, and on its own, that chemical composition is colorless. It needs something added to it to give it color, like the image on the right. These are crystals of natural beryls, and they have green and yellow and blue and pink. And you can see on this list an emerald crystal in a quartz matrix. It actually looks like a very good quality emerald here because oftentimes emeralds have a lot of inclusions, and these inclusions can affect their stability. So they're quite brittle to begin with, but sometimes inclusions can affect them even more so and make them more susceptible to breakage, which is why we often see the emerald cut for emeralds. So that's a rectangular cut with the corners cut off to protect those vulnerable corners. We also have trapeche emeralds, and they are colored by the same coloring elements as our regular emerald. But I wanted to bring your attention to the trapeche emerald because it's just a fun and interesting variety within the emerald. And you can see in the center, and I'll outline it for you, this hexagonal crystal. And the defining feature really of these trapeche emeralds is that they have these hexagonal cores, and then they have these wedges or sections growing outwards from that central hexagonal core. And between them you have different mineral components. You have some colorless beryl and also some black dark components. So trapeche emeralds come from Colombia, and actually Colombia is considered one of the best localities in the world, producing some of the best colored emeralds. So your regular emeralds and your trapeche emeralds can come from Colombia. And the trapeche is named after the wheel that grinds sugarcane. It has spokes similar to that large wheel. Looking at emerald inclusions. Now, why are we looking at inclusions to begin with? Well, firstly, they're of great interest to gemologists. They're really interesting to sort of dive into and investigate. But also, inclusions can tell you a lot of things about a gemstone. Firstly, they can tell you whether or not something is natural or if it's been created artificially in a lab. And these inclusions can really differ greatly between your natural inclusions and your artificial ones. So all of the inclusions that I'm showing you today in emerald and other gemstone varieties are going to be from natural gemstones. So they won't be any artificial inclusions here today. Emeralds, as I mentioned, can often be very included. Sometimes it's referred to as the jardin of the emerald. So you're looking into an included emerald, and it's a nice way of saying there's a lot of stuff going on inside that emerald. Again, inclusions are important because they can also tell you potentially if a gemstone has been treated. They can be altered in some cases. And finally, inclusions can sometimes point the way to where a gemstone is from in the world, also known as its locality. So for example, we have a three-phase inclusion in our top right image. And this is a small jagged cavity, and it has three components in it. It has two solid crystals actually, and I'll outline them with my mouse here, these little square crystals. It has a gas bubble, and it has liquid surrounding everything else within that cavity. Three-phase inclusions are common in Colombian emeralds. So if you do see a three-phase inclusion, you can hopefully assume that you have a Colombian emerald. However, we do know that there are emeralds from other localities that have multiple phase or three-phase inclusions as well, like from Afghanistan. So it's not cut and dry. It's not 100% guaranteed that this emerald, that this inclusion is in a Colombian emerald. But moving on to our other inclusions within our emeralds, we can have so many, but we can have needle-like inclusions here, like these amphibola inclusions. They can also be composed of other minerals, of their gems, for instance. We can also have feathers, and these feathers are actually partially healed fractures, and they occur during growth. So when a gemstone is growing, it can fracture a little bit, and then it re-heals itself as it continues to grow. And these feathers can be quite messy, as you can see in this emerald inclusion here. And they can also be quite neat in other gemstone varieties, and I'll show you that a little bit later. Finally, we can have some calcite rhombs, or well-defined mineral inclusions within our emeralds. And these calcite rhombs are quite fun to find because they are so distinct and so well-defined. And you can see them in emeralds from places like Brazil. Now, green beryl is another variety within our beryl, and I wanted to bring your attention to it because there is a distinction between emeralds and green beryl. Now, what's the difference, you might ask, because they're both green. Well, emeralds, as we define them, are colored by chromium and vanadium, whereas green beryl is colored predominantly by iron. And as you can see, this color here of this green beryl is pretty dull. It's not as vibrant as that emerald that we saw in previous slides. It's kind of a duller yellowish green. However, there is a debate where the definition lies between your green beryls and your emeralds, because you can have green beryls that are colored predominantly by iron that look like a much brighter green. They're a pale emerald green, if you can call it that, and it's a little bit confusing within the trade. And it all comes down to really to money, because if I am buying, I want to be buying a green beryl, whereas if I'm selling, I want to be selling an emerald, because the emerald is going to be much more expensive. Now, currently the debate is still going on. There hasn't been official guidelines in terms of where we draw the line within our iron-colored green beryls that are brightly green colored, but it's food for thought. It's something for you guys to go away and think about it for a bit. Moving on to our next variety, we have aquamarine, which is our blue beryl. It is the birthstone for March, and it can be a really deep blue or a paler blue. It also can be quite a clean mineral, so not a lot of inclusions, unlike our emeralds. And you can see that in the examples here. But you can also have an inclusion that's known as rain. And these are hollow growth tubes that form as the crystal is growing. And you can see it in the central image. And it looks like rain. So that's why it's called that. And it can grow in quite large sizes, and you can see it in Art Deco jewelry, for instance. It was quite popular in that time period, and the more blue color is popular now from the 20th century through today, whereas in the 19th century, the more blue-green color, because aquamarine can be blue and blue-green, or greenish blue, that greenish blue tone was more popular in the 19th century. So you might see that as a more prevalent version of aquamarine in older antique jewelry. But it means of the sea, and sailors wore it sometimes to protect them while they were out on the open ocean. Morganite is our pink or orangey pink variety of beryl, and manganese is responsible for coloring that gemstone. It is also quite a clean gemstone. The example on the right is a really nice big example of morganite, and it's in the Natural History Museum here in London. So if you ever do get a chance to go to the museum, please do stop by and look at their treasure trove of gems, because they have an incredible collection, and this is one of the many pieces within it. Morganite was named after the American banker J.P. Morgan. He was an avid gem collector and had a very important gem collection, especially at the turn of the 20th century, or the early 20th century, I should say. And George Kunz, a gemologist who is well known, has written volumes on gemology. He recommended that this gemstone be named after J.P. Morgan in recognition of his very important gem collection. Heliodor and golden beryl are our yellow beryls. I've put them together in one slide because most of the time yellow beryl is being sold with the name Heliodor, and its name Helios comes from the word sun, so it's our sunshiny beryl, nice bright yellow. It can be quite clean, like our morganite and aquamarine, and it can sometimes have rain-like inclusions as well. Now, Heliodor and golden beryl are distinguished by their colors. So Heliodor can be a paler yellow, sometimes with a bit of a greenish tint to it, whereas our golden beryl is just that, it's golden. It's much more intensely colored yellow, and it can maybe look a little bit orangey yellow as well. But most of the time you'll see any sort of yellow beryl sold as Heliodor. You might have a golden beryl. It doesn't much matter really, because they're both yellow, but there is the distinguishing feature between them just in terms of their color. Red beryl is the rarest of the beryls, of our varieties of beryls, and it was discovered in the Wawa Mountains in Utah, and it was originally named Bixbyte. However, that name has fallen out of favor. It's no longer used because it is actually confused with another mineral called Bixbyite, which is very, very different from red beryl. It's black with a metallic luster. So as you can see, very different from this red beryl. They're colored by manganese, and they're often quite included. So similar to our emeralds, they have lots of stuff inside, lots of inclusions. And they also don't grow in very large sizes. So to have facetable specimens like these is really great, but very unusual. Sometimes red beryl is sold as red emerald, and this is a misnomer. Emerald by definition is green. We've seen it, we know what an emerald is, and you cannot have a red emerald. So it's really red beryl, and that's how it should be marketed. Our final variety that we're going to talk about is goshenite, and this is beryllium aluminium silicate without anything else in it, so it's colorless. And it is often very clean and can grow in larger sizes as well. So it's used sometimes as a diamond simulant or imitation, basically because it is colorless and very clean. However, it doesn't quite stand up head to head with a diamond. As we know, diamonds have a very bright luster or reflectivity of their surface. It's called an adamantine luster. Goshenite will be bright vitreous at best, so it really can't return light in the same way as a diamond. Additionally, diamonds have what is called fire or dispersion, a fair amount of it, and that's those spectral colors that you can see when light is being split by a faceted diamond. Goshenite doesn't have that. So it doesn't look as fiery or lively as a diamond, but it's pretty adequate if you need a quick fix in terms of imitating a diamond. And this was named after Goshen, Massachusetts, where it was first identified as a variety. Our next species is corundum. And as you can see, it's quite a colorful family. I've already told you that it has rubies and sapphires, but there are more colors involved in this species. There are also optical effects, and I'd like to bring your attention to this cabochon over here, this sort of pinkish purplish cabochon that has a nice bright star. And that is an optical effect known as asterism. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's look at the chemical composition. It's aluminium oxide, and by itself, with no additional elements, much like our colorless beryl, it will be colorless. So it's the pure form of corundum. And once you start adding other coloring elements, you'll get your different varieties, like your ruby, which is red, your sapphire or your fancy sapphire, which is all different colors. So sapphires in general, when someone says a sapphire, you immediately think of the color blue. And yes, that is true, sapphires are blue, but there also are alternative colors, as you can see in the image on the right. And those are known as fancy sapphires. And whatever color you have, for instance, yellow, you'll just put it in front of the word sapphire. So I have a yellow sapphire here in this image, or a green sapphire, or a purple sapphire. We also have Padparacha sapphires, which are orange pink. They're an orangey pink. They're really quite beautiful and very rare in nature. A lot of the Padparacha sapphires on the market are treated. They're diffused with beryllium. And if you are buying a Padparacha sapphire, I would be careful if anyone says it's natural, untreated. You definitely need a certificate with that. Also on this list, we have our star ruby and our star sapphire, and that's our corundum with asterism, or that star effect. And it just depends what color it is, whether we call it a ruby or a sapphire, but there's no real difference other than the color. They're both forming in the same way. So on to our ruby, our red corundum. And ruby is so synonymous with the color red that a lot of gemstones before the late 18th century, when gemology was really developed as a science, were called rubies. So if you had a red gemstone, regardless of whether or not it was actually a corundum variety ruby, you'd still call it a ruby. And on the left, you have a really beautiful, clean looking ruby. Rubies can be quite included as well, but they do come without inclusions, and you can see it here. This is a fairly clean one. You can also see on the right a ruby crystal, and that's how they form naturally. So they have 6 sides, or it forms as a hexagon, and they're usually flat and tabular. This is a much darker red than the ruby on the left. You can get very good color quality natural rubies, but just to let you know, most of the rubies and sapphires on the market today are heat treated to enhance or bring out the color that we so desire. And it's not a bad thing, it just needs to be disclosed, that treatment. Because without that treatment, we wouldn't have nearly as many rubies or sapphires on the market as we do today. But rubies are the birthstone for July, and they can range in color from a paler red to a really saturated deep red. Sometimes people refer to it as pigeon's blood red, but it's just a really intense, vivid red. And it is colored by chromium, which is important to note because pink sapphires are also colored by chromium. And there's a debate between pink sapphires and rubies. Where do you draw the line? And it is up to really whether or not you're a buyer or a seller at this point, because there's no definite cutoff point where a pink sapphire ends and a ruby begins. So if I'm buying, again, I want a pink sapphire because it's going to be cheaper. And if I'm selling, I definitely want to be selling a ruby because it's going to be more money for me as the seller. But that is also up for debate. There's no international guideline that is consistent throughout the world for the distinction between a pink sapphire and a ruby. They're both colored by chromium, and it just depends on who's buying and selling, really. These are ruby inclusions that are natural. As I said, I'm only showing you natural inclusions today. And on the left, you can see a crystal inclusion. It's kind of a rounded crystal inclusion. And you can see these in lots of different rubies. And you can see it with your 10 times loop or with your microscope. And oftentimes you'll probably be able to focus in much better with your microscope than your loupe, especially if they're small crystal inclusions. The middle image are rutile needle inclusions within ruby. These rutile needles, they can be long or they can be short, depending upon the ruby, and they run in 3 different directions. I'll point these directions out with my mouse in case you're having trouble distinguishing them. It's sort of forming a triangle right here, but you have this inclusion, and that inclusion running in 3 directions, and they intersect each other at angles of 60 degrees and 120 degrees. Keep those 3 directions in mind for later when I talk about asterism. The inclusion on the right is a crystal inclusion with a surrounding stress crack. So maybe it's been heated a little bit naturally and the crystal has expanded ever so slightly and caused this stress crack around it. These types of crystals can actually be very helpful in trying to determine whether or not a ruby has been heated to produce the red color or to enhance the red color, or whether it hasn't been. Now, this inclusion hasn't been heat treated. However, when you heat a ruby to a high enough temperature, you sometimes see these crystals in the middle completely altered. So this crystal in the middle, if it's heated to a high enough temperature, will melt and then turn white. And they call these snowballs within our rubies and our sapphires as well. And that's a good indication of whether or not you have had heat treatment on your ruby. Sapphires are the blue corundum species, and this is aluminium oxide plus iron and titanium. Now, I've specified that this is for blue sapphires only because our fancy sapphires with all those different colors have different coloring elements. So this is really iron and titanium only for blue sapphires. This is our birthstone for September, and sapphires can range in color from a really pale blue to a really dark, intense, inky blue. It can be really saturated blue, very similar to Princess Diana's engagement ring that is now worn by Kate Middleton. So you can see there's a huge range in color, but they're all considered sapphires because they're blue corundum. And it just depends on taste whether or not you want a paler blue sapphire or maybe a more intense blue sapphire. The image on the right is a sapphire crystal, and this is very well defined. This is typical of sapphires versus rubies in that this sapphire crystal is nice and elongated. It has 6 sides still like our ruby, and it is a bipyramidal form. So it's just coming to 2 points. And you can also see striations on the crystal faces. It's just the lines that you can see there on that crystal face. Looking at sapphire inclusions, there are many, and just to let you know, inclusions in corundum are many. There are so many different types of inclusions. I'm just scratching the surface, so if you want to know more, please do investigate further after this webinar. There are plenty of resources for you to look at different inclusions in sapphires and rubies and other gemstones as well. Here we can see silk is making another appearance, or rutile, and it's called silk because it looks like long strands of white fine silk that are in this sapphire here. And again, they're running in 3 different directions, intersecting each other at 60 or 120 degrees. Sometimes you can have a lot of silk and sometimes very minimal silk. And you can also have microscopic inclusions within a sapphire that can cause it to look a little bit milky or a little bit velvety. And that's the appearance that you want for your cashmere sapphires. That's a very typical appearance, that kind of velvety blue of those cashmere sapphires. You can also have lots of different feathers, and when they're really well defined, like this one here, it looks very neat. It's called a fingerprint feather. And it's, again, a partially healed fracture, and it is planar, typically, these feathers. So if you're looking at your sapphire from one angle, you'll see the whole feather, and the other angle, you'll see just a line, because that's how it formed. It was sort of a fracture and then it rehealed. And finally, we have color zoning. This is a fine image of some hexagonal color zoning here. And if you remember, our sapphire crystal had 6 sides. So sometimes you can see the echoes of that crystal growth within that color zoning. Also, you can sometimes within sapphires just have some straight color zoning, and I'm outlining an area here with my mouse. Sometimes you'll only just see that, some straight color zoning, or maybe even just one angle of that hexagonal color zoning. And that is wonderful to see because that indicates that you have a natural sapphire versus, say, an artificial sapphire created by the Verneuil flame fusion method. And that method, it's grown in a lab or a factory setting, and the color zoning is curved and subtle, whereas this is really well-defined straight color zoning. So look for that. It's really great to see. I love it when a sapphire has some good straight color zoning because it makes me feel confident that I have a nice natural sapphire. And I also like to see evidence of its crystal growth. Our final variety that we're going to discuss today in detail of our corundum is our star, ruby, and sapphire examples here. They are aluminium oxide plus a coloring element, so some chromium for a star ruby, and also excess rutile. Now these rutile needles need to be profuse. We need a lot of them in order to reflect the light off of them. They run in 3 different directions. So remember, in our inclusion images, we had those inclusions running in 3 different directions, and that's what gives us the arms of the star, or the rays of the star, as they're also known. They can have 6 or 12 rays, and to bring out this wonderful effect, you need a pinpoint of light. So you can use your phone light even, or the sun, or a little pocket torch or pocket flashlight to shine on the top of the cabochon of these corundum beauties here to bring out that effect. And it's like a little magic trick because it really well defines that star when you use that light source. The most well-known star sapphire that I can think of is the Star of India. It's in the Museum of Natural History in New York City. It is a beauty. It's a nice sort of grayish blue color, and it's enormous. It's about the size of a golf ball. It's 564 carats, and it's remarkable not only for its size, but also its star is really well defined, which can be tough to find in natural sapphires and star sapphires and rubies. And also it has both a star on the top of the cabochon and the base of that cabochon. So it's a really great example of asterism in corundum. And oftentimes you'll have star rubies and sapphires with a slightly rounded base instead of a flat cabochon base if they are natural, to preserve that weight and to be able to charge that little bit extra per carat because they are more rare, and especially if they have a really good star, they're exceedingly rare. They're usually not quite as well centered or sharp with straight bands as they could be. Now, before I move on to garnet, I want to ask you all a question. What color is garnet? What color would you say a garnet is? Chances are most of you have answered in your head, red. And you wouldn't be wrong, garnets definitely are red, but they also come in other colors, like green and orange and purple and a pinky red. So they are varied in terms of their color. But I want to talk in a bit more detail about garnet and its chemical composition because it's a bit more complex than our beryls and our corundums. Garnet is actually a huge group of garnet species, and the most important garnets to us gemologically or in the jewelry are part of 2 series known as isomorphous series. They're called the pyrrolspite and the eugrandite series. Listed here are some end members or other varieties of these 2 series, and I'll go into them in a bit more detail in the next slide, but I just wanted you to see this list and a nice variety of colors here, and to see some different names so that you might recognize maybe an almandine garnet or a hessonite or a tsavorite garnet. You may have heard of these, and I'll show you images of them in a moment. This is a fantastic image, actually, of our garnet species groups. This, to me, embodies the nature of this group so well, because while we do have different names for the end members of the isomorphous series, like pyrope, almandine, and spessartine, they're always a little bit intermixed. They're never quite as pure as we think they are or as they could be. So pyrope will always have just a tiny bit, at least, of almandine in there, and vice versa. An isomorphous series, just to break it down, it means same form, but there are different elements that are exchanged. With our garnet group, we have two variables. We have X and we have Y. So the overall chemical formula is X3Y2 SiO43, and that involves silica and oxygen within it. But these X and the Y variables, one will be constant and one will change depending upon which series you're looking at. For instance, our pyrospite series, the Y is the constant, and it's set at aluminium. The X will change depending on which end member that you have. So for instance, pyrope will have magnesium, not manganese. Manganese is for spessartine, and almandine will have iron in the place of that X. In our eugrandite series, our X is now our constant, and that is calcium. The Y will now be the variable, and that variable will be either chromium or aluminium or iron, just depending upon which end member or variety it is. And as you can see, we have different colors here with our groups. So our pyrospite series is a lot more red and orange in coloration, whereas our eugrandite series, it has a lot more green and yellow and brownish green. There is some orange in there too, and you'll see it in just a moment. But let's look at our species groups in a bit more detail in our isomorphous series. This is our pyrope garnet. Now the X is our variable, as I mentioned, and it is magnesium here. It's a nice bright red. It can be red to purplish red, and it is sometimes a really vibrant red, and this can be caused by the presence of chromium. So you have a nice bright red here, and pyrope actually comes from a word relating to fire, and you can see it looks like a glowing ember. Sometimes it can have a lot of inclusions, and sometimes it can be quite clean, maybe some rounded crystal inclusions in there. The next garnet, almandine garnet, is probably the garnet that you think of when you associate the color red with garnet, that really deep, intense red. And garnet is the birthstone for January. You'll see a lot of red garnet in birthstone jewelry, and it will most likely be an almandine or a pyrope or somewhere on the spectrum between them, or on the leg between those two end members. I wanted to show you the crystal here on the right. This is a rhombic dodecahedron crystal, and this is the habit for many garnets within these series. And it's just a fancy way of saying that it has 12 sides, and each side is shaped like a rhomb or a little kite shape, a diamond. And I'll outline it here. You have a rhombic shaped face. And I wanted to bring this up as well because you can sometimes have needle-like inclusions in almandine garnets that will run parallel to the edges of these rhombic faces. And you can even have asterism if you have enough of these inclusions. And the asterism can have 4 rays or even 6 rays depending on the orientation that it's cut. So fun facts about almandine. Our next variety is our orange and spessartine, and it is a bright orange. It can be very bright and very vivid. It can also be a little bit more reddish orange, and the very bright version of this stone, as pictured here, is sometimes called mandarin garnet. So you may have seen that in the trade, and that just means it's spessartine garnet, and it's colored by manganese. That X variable has been replaced with manganese here in the chemical composition. Internally, it has a typical shredded appearance. And this shredded appearance is generally caused by wavy feathers filled with liquid droplets. This appearance can help distinguish spessartine from another orange garnet that I'll talk about in a couple of slides called hessonite. And they can both be very similar in color, in orange color, and this is where chemical composition can also come into play in terms of defining our varieties. Because as you exchange these chemical elements, for instance, you will get different results with gemological instruments like a refractometer or your spectroscope, for instance, because these different elements change the composition ever so slightly, and you can tell the difference between the varieties based on certain numerical results. I won't go into that in too much detail, but it's good to note in terms of garnet in particular, because you really do need extra instrumentation to identify these different species sometimes, because they can look so similar, especially between our pyrope and our almandine garnets and our spessartine versus our hessonite, for instance. Another variety within this group, within this isomorphous series, is the color change garnet. And it's along that line, that range between our pyrope and our spessartine. And color change is an optical effect that depends upon the lighting source that you use. So you can use either daylight or incandescent or candlelight. And these lights have different concentrations of certain wavelengths of certain colors. So daylight has a lot more of a concentration of blue wavelengths. So therefore, our garnet is going to appear a greenish blue, and you can see in the image on the left. Now, the image on the right is the same stone. It's just being illuminated with incandescent light, which has a lot more red in it, many more red wavelengths. So it's a higher concentration of that color, and it makes it look purple or a purplish red. So this color change is quite distinct. And another gemstone that you may have heard of that has a color change effect that is quite striking, and even more so than this color change, is alexandrite, which is a variety of chrysoberyl. It's emerald by day, ruby by night, and it looks like that, a vibrant green emerald in daylight and a really rich red hued ruby in candlelight or incandescent light. So color change is kind of like a little magic trick, and you really need to see it sometimes to believe it. There's an exceptional alexandrite in the Natural History Museum in London, so please do come and see it. It's really breathtaking. Uvarovite is the first end member in our eugrandite series, and it's bright green. Personally, this is, I think, my favorite garnet. I'm even wearing my uvarovite ring today to show my allegiance to this garnet because I love it so much. But it is bright green, and it is colored by chromium, which has actually replaced our Y. So in this series, remember, our X is our calcium, that's our constant. And now our Y is being replaced by various elements, and chromium is jumping in here. And if you remember chromium from our emerald, that's also causing that bright green color. And here you can see lots of little crystals, and uvarovite sadly never grows crystals larger than maybe a few millimeters across. So it's always going to be in this druzy form, which is lots of little crystals on the host rock. And so if it is set in jewelry like my ring, you're going to see that dark rock background behind it because you can't facet the individual crystals. It's still beautiful nonetheless. It's sort of like diving into Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz. Love it. Grossular garnet is our next end member of our series, of our eugrandite series. And on this slide, you can see tsavorite and hydrogrossular garnets. The tsavorite is our garnet on the left. It's a bright green garnet, and its coloring mechanism is actually quite complex. So I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, just to let you know that chromium, vanadium, and manganese are present, and they're in various concentrations, and they all kind of work together to cause this green color. Sometimes tsavorite can be really clean and inclusion-free, and other times you can see things like needle-like inclusions pictured here, or very neat, feathers. So they can be quite tidy and very sort of organized within the tsavorite. It was discovered in the 1960s or the late 1960s by Campbell Bridges, and it was brought to the wider market by Tiffany & Co. So you may have seen it in some Tiffany jewelry from sort of the 70s onwards. Hydroglossular garnet is actually a combination or within the range between glossular garnet and another type of garnet that's in a different series called Hibschite garnet. And it is sometimes sold as hydrogarnet as well. It can come in different colors. So this is one of the colors, this green color, often translucent to opaque. And it can also be pink or grayish white or brown. Now, if it's this green color, sometimes it's sold under the misnomer of Transvaal jade from South Africa. And it is similar to jade in its coloration. It's, it looks kind of polycrystalline like your jade, but it has these dark inclusions which can distinguish it. And also it is most certainly not jade. So any other gemological tests using, for instance, a refractometer will be able to distinguish that. So if you do see something like this being marketed as Transvaal jade, just be careful and ask a few questions. It might actually be this type of garnet. We also have hessonite garnet as a part of our glossular variety. So it's our orange glossular, and it's colored by sort of manganese and iron. It's got a treacly internal appearance, which is very typical of hessonite. So it looks like whiskey and water kind of mixed together. And it also has these characteristic rounded, colorless crystal inclusions. They can be quite profuse, and you can see them with your loupe, your 10 times loupe, and also, of course, with your microscope. And it's good to note this internal appearance because if you remember our spessartine garnet, which is also orange, can be very similar in color, and the internal appearance is very different between the two, that shredded spessartine appearance versus this kind of treacly hessonite appearance. So it's good to keep that in mind. Hessonite also was called cinnamon stone at some point, and it can also be a much more reddish orange or even a kind of brownish yellow. So it has a little bit of a range of color, not just this bright, intense orange. Andradite is the final garnet that I'm going to talk about, and I'm talking about demantoid within that andradite end member of the series, of eugrandite series. And it's colored by chromium to give it that nice bright green color. It's known for its sort of bright green to yellowish green color. It has a subadamantine luster, so it reflects light very well from the surface of that gem. And it's second only really to diamond. If you remember, I said diamonds have that adamantine luster, so they reflect a ton of light from their facet surfaces, and demantoid reflects almost as much light. Demantoids also have a lot of fire or dispersion, and these are, again, these spectral colors where the light is split. And sometimes this fire is masked by the color of the demantoid, so you might not see as many colors flashing within it as you could. Another thing to note about demantoid garnets is that this is one of the few gemstones where you really want a big eye visible inclusion, and that is known as the horsetail inclusion that you can see in the image on the right. The reason is because demantoids from Russia are considered historically to be some of the best demantoids on the market, and they have this characteristic horsetail inclusion. So as I said about inclusions earlier, sometimes they can help you determine where in the world this demantoid was found or a gemstone was found and mined. But the demantoid here, yes, it has a horsetail, and yes, it could possibly be from Russia. However, we have discovered that there are other locations or localities that produce demantoids that also have horsetail inclusions, like Italy, for instance. So it's not cut and dry. It's not 100% guaranteed that if I have a demantoid with a horsetail inclusion with these golden fibrous inclusions. As you can see here, it looks like a big spray. It's not guaranteed that it's from Russia, but it's a nice indication. It's something nice to have anyway. I enjoy inclusions, so I wouldn't mind a demantoid with an inclusion in it. Here is our quartz species. This is our last species of today. So thanks for holding on. We've got to get through quartz and then we'll get to the quiz and the questions. But here we have a lot of different colors of quartz. And on the next slide, I'll show you some varieties. So this is to demonstrate that quartz is actually an enormous species because silicon dioxide, which is this chemical composition, is very prevalent in the crust, in the Earth's crust. It is the second most common mineral, second only to feldspars, which have moonstones and sunstones and those kinds of gems. So quartz is really abundant. So we divide quartz into crystalline and polycrystalline branches to give us a bit of distinction. The crystalline branch is known as also the macrocrystalline branch, and this involves crystals that are large or large enough to be faceted as a single crystal gemstone. The other branch, the polycrystalline branch, involves chalcedonies with things like agate. You may have heard of agate or chrysoprase. And these are lots of little interlocking crystals that grow together. And you'll oftentimes see them as translucent or opaque gemstones. We also have aventurine quartz, which I'll talk about later because it has a fun optical effect. But let's get started with our macrocrystalline quartzes. We've got a lot of quartz to get through. And our quartz, which is macrocrystalline, and all of our quartzes really are distinguished by color. So unlike our garnets, which are extremely complex, we're simplifying it back down again with our quartz that is macrocrystalline. And you can see we have a few varieties here, our amethyst, which is purple, our citrine, which is yellow, and so on and so forth. And I'll get into those on the next few slides. The image on the top right is just a fun image showing you a rock crystal cluster of quartz crystals. And they are very well defined and quite beautiful. It's a really beautiful mineral specimen. Rock crystal is our silicon dioxide that doesn't have any real additional elements giving it color. So the image on the left is a nice example of a rock crystal, and it has 6 sides to it. It comes to a pyramidal termination, and they often have a broken base because they're being taken out of geodes or out of their host rock. Sometimes you can have doubly terminated rock crystals known as Herkimer diamonds from Herkimer, New York. They are not diamonds by any means, but rock crystal is actually an alternative birthstone for April, which also has the diamond. So maybe there's something to it, but they're definitely not diamonds. Rock crystal is known for its range of inclusions. And on the right, you can see one of the examples, pyrite. Here, you can see those little crystals very well defined within that rock crystal. And quartz has an incredible array of inclusions. It's really fascinating actually to delve into the world of quartz inclusions. We have an article on GemA's blog that is all about quartz inclusions. So I encourage you to check out our blog and to look at that article because there are some stunning images of rock crystal inclusions. I have a few more images of inclusions on this next slide. The top left image is called tourmalinated quartz, and it has a lot of tourmaline crystal inclusions. These inclusions can be anywhere from sort of a dark black color to maybe a greenish color. We also have rutile in our rock crystal. You see rutile is coming back again and again. It's a pretty common inclusion actually. And it sometimes forms as this starburst pattern, as you can see in the top right image. It can also form as just individual needles in kind of clusters or random orientations. And it can be a gold color, it can be a kind of coppery color or a silver color, like the Olympic medals. Sometimes these inclusions, these rutile inclusions, can be so fine that kind of quartz is called angel hair or Venus hair quartz, and it can be quite beautiful, just fine fibers of that rutile running through the rock crystal quartz. Finally, we can have some two-phase inclusions in rock crystal quartz. And here you can see a bubble that is encapsulated in a cavity with a liquid. Sometimes these bubbles actually move as you move the quartz sample in your hands. So that's really exciting to me, because this gas existed when these were forming. So millions of years ago, this gas bubble was trapped inside this quartz, and it's been there ever since. So it's kind of a nice little time capsule of when the quartz was being formed. And in this quartz, you can see there is petroleum oil as well, and that goes bright neon yellow when you use UV fluorescence to light it up. It's really, really cool. So I encourage you maybe to get one of these samples and use some UV light and have a bit of fun. Our next example of our macrocrystalline quartz is our purple quartz, which is amethyst. Amethyst is the birthstone for February. It can sometimes have some straight color zoning, as you can see in the faceted example in the image on the left. And its color can range from a very pale purple to a really intense kind of bluish or reddish purple. So the color can really vary. You can also get these inclusions, like the top right one called a tiger stripe inclusion, and that is a partially healed feather, or a partially healed fracture known as a feather. Also planar, like those fingerprints in our sapphires, and it has this characteristic kind of zigzag shape. And if you see a purple gemstone with this tiger stripe inclusion, then you can conclude that it is most likely an amethyst. Obviously, you want to do a couple of other tests just to make sure that you are drawing the right conclusion, but this is very specific to amethyst. You can also get other inclusions like those red ribbon-like inclusions on the bottom right, not necessarily as common, say, as the tiger stripe. We have citrine, which is our yellow variety of our macrocrystalline quartz. And naturally, it doesn't occur very often. So a lot of the citrine on the market is actually heat-treated amethyst. You can get similar inclusions to amethyst because some of it is heat-treated amethyst, but also of the way it grows. And you can see here a little citrine from a geode. Citrine is an alternative birthstone for November babies. So instead of that yellow topaz, you can get a citrine, and it's quite bright and sunshiny. It can be a pale yellow to a more intense deep yellow like the one pictured here. A variety that I didn't list is known as ametrine, and I wanted to just show you because it's quite a fun variety of our macrocrystalline quartz. It forms with two different colors, and it's named after amethyst and citrine coming together. So you have that purple zoning and that yellow zoning. Oftentimes when it's faceted, you can see in the image on the left, it is a faceted example with two areas of color separated by a straight line. But you can also have more geometric divisions of color. And the example on the right is our natural ametrine, and it has some triangles of yellow or more geometric forms. I'll point those out with my mouse here, and then the purple beyond it. One of the only commercial sources for natural ametrine is in Bolivia, called the Anahi mine. But you can also treat amethyst in part to get ametrine as well, but natural ametrine can be quite beautiful. Smoky quartz is our brown or our grayish brown to even black, a variety of macrocrystalline quartz. Its color is caused by irradiation. It creates a color hole center, it knocks an electron out of place, which then causes the light to be absorbed in a different way than if it were just silicon dioxide, and it gives it that brownish color. These can be quite clean, and I've seen them set in things like cocktail rings, very neutral color. They can be quite popular at auction. We have rose quartz here, which is our pink macrocrystalline quartz, and it usually forms in what is known as a massive habit. Now, this doesn't necessarily relate to size. Yes, rose quartz and quartz in general can grow to very large sizes. They can even be a few tons in weight. I mean, you know, bigger than the room I'm in practically. But massive habits just mean that this is not a well-defined crystal. So you can see lots of random faces on this example here, and that's what it's meant by massive. This is colored by microscopic fibrous inclusions, and sometimes based on the orientation of these inclusions, you can have an optical effect known as asterism. We've seen asterism before, like in our corundum. And the difference between the two, though, is that rose quartz, you have to shine light through the rose quartz to be able to see that star, whereas with our corundum, we were shining light on top of the cabochon. And you'll have to cut it as a cabochon or maybe a sphere to be able to see that asterism as well. Prasiolite is our green quartz. It is also quite rare in nature. There are several different localities that do produce natural green prasiolite, but a lot of it that's on the market is also heat-treated amethyst. So just beware when you're looking around and you see a green stone like this. Someone might call it a green amethyst. That is a misnomer. It should be prasiolite still, because that is the green macro quartz. Amethyst is purple by definition. Moving on to our polycrystalline quartzes, we have a lot of different varieties within this branch, if you will, of the quartz species. So within our chalcedony, we have different things like agate and carnelian and chrysoprase, divided in color, really, color and maybe color distribution, like in banding. Our agate is typically banded, and you can see that it either has straight banding or angular banding. And sometimes you can actually see the banding comes full circle, and that's known sometimes as fortification agate. So it looks like a little fortress within your agate. And you can even find larger crystals in the center here, not in this example, but in other examples, that give you the evidence of geode growth. So when geodes grow, they often have chalcedony, that cryptocrystalline or polycrystalline quartz. And as it cools slower and slower, it forms larger crystals going into the center. So you'll have both types of quartz within the same geode. Oftentimes, agate is sold maybe as coasters or as table decorations and slices, and it can be dyed. So you might see bright blue or bright pink examples. Those are not natural colors of agate. Agate is much more subdued, as you can see here with these examples, but they can still be appealing. And if you like them, go for it, because agate is beautiful. There's also bloodstone, and that is an alternative birthstone for March, so either aquamarine or bloodstone. And it's characterized by this deep green color, this dark green color, with these bright red spots of coloration. They can be iron oxide or jasper, and you can carve bloodstone and also most polycrystalline varieties as well. And you can, I've seen them in fob seals, for instance, or set into rings where you can seal your letter with a bit of melted wax and your initials or your family crest. So this and other polycrystalline quartzes and macrocrystalline quartzes actually hold up very well to being carved. Chrysoprase and dendritic agate are a couple more varieties here. We have our bright green chrysoprase on the left, and it can be really vibrant, really luminous at times. I really like chrysoprase because it's just that wonderful pop of green color. On the right, we have dendritic and also moss agate. And moss agate looks like it actually has enclosed moss within it, but those are mineral inclusions. It's not actually plant material. Our dendritic agate can be really pictorial. So here we have an example that looks like it's, a big strand of kelp, for instance, coming up from the seafloor, but you can get large landscapes, for instance. You can sometimes have dendritic agate forming in the shape of someone's profile, and there were lots of fun collectors back in the day, like the 19th century, looking for profiles in dendritic agate, maybe of their friend, say, oh, I found your face in dendritic agate. So I enjoy dendritic agate, and those are the more collectible examples of dendritic agate when they have something that looks very pictorial. Fire agate and tiger's eye both have optical effects. Our fire agate on the left is a kind of reddish brown chalcedony, and you can see it's forming in this botryoidal or kind of a blob-like form of the crystals, and it has this iridescence that you can see going across the surface of those rounded forms. On the right is tiger's eye, and it can show you chatoyancy, and I'll point out the chatoyancy with my mouse. It's this bright single band of light, and it's reflecting off of the fibers that are within tiger's eye, which can be either this golden yellow color, or it can be blue, known as hawk's eye. Sometimes tiger's eye is cut as a cabochon to really show off that cat's eye effect. The final quartz variety that we're going to look at today is aventurine quartz, which is actually a quartzite, and its color is derived from these inclusions of green mica. They're these platy inclusions, and they reflect light off of them in what's known as an internal reflection effect. The optical effect here is known as aventurescence, and it's basically that sparkly effect that you can see in the image on the left. It looks like glitter inside the stone, and that is as a result of those green mica inclusions. So it's just a fun little quartz at the end of this lecture to get you going and to see that, they can all be pretty fun in the end. So that's it for our species and varieties. I hope you're all still with me, that you've learned a lot today. We've gotten through a heck of a lot of material, and we've covered our 4 gemstone species with their varieties, with its beryl, with its emeralds and aquamarines and morganite, and our corundum with its rubies and sapphires, our garnets with hessonite and tsavorite and uvarovite and spessartine, those kinds of garnets, as well as our quartz, which has so many varieties. I didn't even have time to get through all of them, but I encourage you all to look further and to investigate all those different species and varieties out there. We looked at their chemical compositions and how that relates to the varieties, how it alters them or maybe doesn't, as well as their colors and how that defines certain varieties. We looked at some typical inclusions as well as their optical effects. So now it's time for our little mini quiz. Don't worry, you don't have to do it if you don't want to. I'm going to launch it. There are only 4 questions here, multiple choice or true false, so you don't have to type anything in. And I've launched it for you all to look at. And while you are looking at it, I know that some people may have trouble viewing the quiz. So I'm actually going to read out the questions for you guys who don't actually have access to seeing the quiz. So you can still participate, at least scribble it down on a piece of paper, see how you did. So question 1 is, which 3 gemstones are a variety of the beryl species? A, goshenite, B, hessonite, C, emerald, D, aquamarine, C, ruby. So you have 3 of the 5 there that are part of that beryl species. Question 2 is true, false. Silk is an inclusion in corundum. True or false? 3. What color is tsavorite garnet? Is it A, red, B, green, or C, orange? And question 4, which of the following are macrocrystalline varieties of quartz? Is it A, agate, B, amethyst, C, aventurine quartz, D, chrysoprase, or E, rock crystal? there are a couple of options within there. I'm going to review the test now and share the results with you all so you can see how you did. So we did pretty well overall, I'd say. So question 1, which 3 gemstones are a variety of the beryl species? It was goshenite, emerald, and aquamarine. So goshenite, our colorless beryl; emerald, our green beryl colored by chromium and vanadium; aquamarine, our blue beryl. Question 2, silk is an inclusion in corundum. True, I've shown you a few pictures of it, so hopefully you remembered that. 3, what color is tsavorite garnet? It is green. So hopefully you remembered that not all garnets are red or maybe even orange. Tsavorite is that bright green garnet that was discovered by Campbell Bridges in Tanzania. Question 4, which of the following are macrocrystalline varieties of quartz? This tripped some of you up, and maybe some of you didn't get a chance to answer it all. I may have gone through it a little bit quickly. Sorry about that. But remember, macrocrystalline quartz varieties are those large crystals that can be faceted, like our amethyst, which is purple, and our rock crystal, which is colorless. All the other varieties that are on the list here, agate, aventurine, quartz, and chrysoprase, are polycrystalline. So they're not macrocrystalline. They have a lot of interlocking crystals growing within one another. So next up, questions. I'm gonna scroll through this chat here and see if anyone has any questions they want to ask. So let's see. I have a question here about chalcedony as a species or a variety. So chalcedony is basically a variety of the quartz species overall, and within that there are little sub-varieties because that's further divided. So I hope that answers your question. Agate is a variety of chalcedony, which is a variety of quartz. Does that make sense? It's sort of little subcategories within that quartz. Common. I'm not too familiar with exactly what causes that trapeche effect within them. However, they do have a trapeche pattern. Yes, you guys are correct. You're on it with those trapeche stones. And let's see. I've got, is Herkimer diamond a rock crystal or something else completely? Herkimer diamond is rock crystal. It's just called a Herkimer diamond because it's from Herkimer and also because of its specific form. It has a double termination, so pointed pyramidal termination on either end, and they can have a slightly longer or slightly shorter prism between the two, but they're often quite kind of short and stubby, like maybe kind of, you know, this long, maybe a bit smaller, and they're called Herkimer diamonds, but it's really rock crystal quartz. It's not a diamond at all. I'm just gonna see if there's one more. Let's see. Oh, lots of nice comments from everyone. Thank you very much. And I think that's it actually for the questions, because we've run a bit over the time. So sorry to keep you longer than intended. Hopefully you've enjoyed it anyway. And there's nothing left to say really, except thank you. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for tuning in and taking the time to learn more about gemstones and to entertain yourselves a bit with our GemA information for you about gemstones. So again, if you have any questions at all, you can go to, you can email us at education@gema.com. You can also follow us on Instagram, and you can also follow us on YouTube. We'll have hopefully a new video for you every week for the foreseeable future with all of these webinars. So if you didn't catch all of today or you didn't catch previous webinars, they're available for you. Please subscribe. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe and take care of yourselves.